At sunrise the Blackthorn estate looked like a promise no one could keep, gold light spilling across stone terraces, a glasshouse breathing mist, and a white-fenced paddock where a stallion stood as if cut from moonlight left behind. The valley woke soft and slow, but inside the big house everything had already been arranged to appear effortless, gardeners pruning in straight lines, servants polishing railings that were already bright, and a kitchen orchestra clattering towards perfection. Evelyn Blackthorn watched it all from the east balcony, small hands wrapped around a wrought iron rail that felt cold even in May. She was 10, a little thin, with a sprinkling of freckles and a habit of holding herself still, as if stillness might make her invisible. The morning breeze lifted a strand of coppery hair across her cheek, she tucked it behind her ear and shifted her weight, carefully, because shifting was always an announcement. The brace beneath her dress, sleek leather warmed by the body, buckled down her right calf, clicked softly. The click had become a measure of everything since the day she learned words like deformity and defect, words adults stitched into sentences and then pretended not to notice. Down by the paddock, the white stallion saw her. He always did. Juniper lifted his head from the grass, ears pricking, and gave the smallest nicker, a sound that seemed to start in his chest and end in hers. She raised her arm and waved. He stepped once toward the fence, then twice, then was pacing along the rail like a tide meeting the shore, answering her in a language that wasn't made of words. "Miss Evelyn, your father asked that you be ready by 8. Mrs. Hart, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway with a napkin and a gentleness that never announced itself. "Breakfast in the sunroom, dear." "Is he in a good mood?" Evelyn asked, keeping her eyes on the paddock. Mrs. Hart hesitated. "He's hosting a very important announcement today. That always puts him in a purposeful mood." She softened it with a smile. "Come along." I made sure they saved the warm rolls. Evelyn took the hallway slowly, heel-toe, the rhythm she had been taught by a patient physiotherapist and a mother who had believed in time. The marble floor mirrored chandeliers like a lake full of stars. It also made her footsteps echo in a way that reminded her of being followed, even when she wasn't. On the landing she paused at a portrait, her mother, Amelia Blackthorn, caught forever in the act of laughing, chin tilted, light in her eyes. The painter had brushed a white horse in the background as a suggestion, not a fact, a smear of pale movement behind Amelia's shoulder. "You named him," Evelyn whispered, as she always did. "So he'd have something soft to answer to." The sunroom shone. Her father stood at the far end, phone to his ear, voice even and measured, a man who had practiced sounding like victory until it sat naturally on his tongue. Charles Blackthorn was tall, elegant, perfectly shaved, his cuff links the same blue as a mountain lake in winter. He ended the call and turned with that quick assessing glance he carried like a blade. "Morning, Evelyn." "Good morning, father." He crossed to her and brushed a kiss against her hair without bending quite enough to smudge the crease of his suit. "Mrs. Hart, coffee?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Hart said, already pouring. He angled his body toward the windows, toward the lawns that rolled green and docile down to the paddocks. "Do you know what today is?" "Your announcement," Evelyn said. "The new hospital wing. The press is coming." "Our hospital wing," he corrected, gently, the way someone corrects a child for reaching too near a flame. "Blackthorn Memorial. We'll cut the ribbon next quarter. Investors need to see continuity. They need to see that in a changing world, certain names still mean something." Evelyn buttered a roll and tried not to think of how the word memorial felt in her mouth, heavy, like a coin she didn't want. "Mother would have liked that," she said. Something flickered across his face, a brief shadow over a perfect day. "Your mother wanted the world to be better," he said. "I want the world to be orderly. Those are not opposites." He sipped his coffee and looked at her brace. "How is it?" "It doesn't hurt much. When it rains, a little. Mr. Temple says I'm putting more weight on my heel." She slipped into her prepared report the way she'd learned to slip into shoes, carefully, watching his eyes. "I can trot with Juniper for almost a minute now. On grass." His smile was thin and practiced. "You know the rules. No riding when there are eyes on the property." "I know," she said, making her voice obedient. It was the one skill she knew he valued. "Good girl." He set the cup down. "Stay close to the house this morning. I don't want you near the staff entrances. There will be cameras. We must avoid distractions." The word landed softly, then unfolded sharp. Evelyn felt it press against her ribs. "Distractions," she echoed. He reached to straighten the collar of her dress. "Do you know why people succeed, Evelyn?" His tone shifted, lecture-friendly. "Because they remove unpredictability. They learn to look like they have no problems. They are kind in public and ruthless in their planning. The world believes what it sees. She looked back toward the paddock, where Juniper had returned to the far corner, as if to give them privacy he couldn't possibly understand. And what if the world sees me? He touched her cheek with a fingertip, almost tender. Then the world will see that the blackthorns protect their own. Which is why you will stay inside. He left as efficiently as he entered, a scent of expensive cologne and strategy trailing behind him. Mrs. Hart set down a glass of orange juice and stood there a moment as if listening to a clock only she could hear. You know he does love you, she said, and the way she said it made it sound like a hope that needed a hand to cross the road. I know, Evelyn said, because it was easier than saying anything more complicated. She finished her juice and asked, may I go to the paddock before the guests arrive? Just for a minute. Mrs. Hart looked toward the hallway where Charles had vanished and then back at Evelyn. 10 minutes, she said. Take the garden path. Keep to the hedges. Evelyn slipped out into the morning, down past rose beds that flamed without fragrance, along a gravel walk that trembled faint under her step. The nearby fountain flickered with coins, other people's wishes pressed into her father's water. At the end of the path, the fence. Juniper was already there, breath silver in the shade, mane lifting as if wind were an invisible hand combing through it. Hi, she said, voice dropping in relief. She slid her palm along the cool rail and then passed through the gate, careful where the brace made the ground feel uneven. He lowered his head and pushed his velvet nose against her shoulder, huffing in a warm circle that made her laugh. His eyes, huge and dark and endlessly present, searched her the way he always did, as if memorizing where she'd been while they were apart. You look like a cloud got tired of pretending to be a cloud, she told him. She held up her fingers, and he nuzzled each one, inventorying her. She showed him the ribbon she'd braided for him, pale blue, worn smooth. For luck today. For both of us. She worked the ribbon into his forelock and stepped back to see, chin tilted, pretending she could see the whole of him when she was always too close to really look. He flicked one ear, then the other, then stood very still, as if he understood that being seen was the beginning of being safe. Walk, she asked. They traced the inner edge of the fence together, she on the path, he matching her pace on the grass. Heel toe. Heel toe. The rhythm steadied her breathing. A song her mother used to hum threaded through her mind, something simple about swallows and home. Juniper's shadow fell across her like shade under a tree. They reached the corner where the paddock bordered a swath of young poplars, their leaves the green of new promises. Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, letting the quiet touch her. The estate was never truly quiet, not with the staff murmuring and the constant hum of generators and the occasional far-off thrum of helicopter blades from the private landing strip. But here there were other sounds layered beneath the human ones, grass tearing between teeth, a fly's brief insistence, a bird stitching two branches together with song. Miss Evelyn. The voice came from the path. Tom, the stable hand, stood awkwardly with his cap in both hands. He was young, not much older than the interns who pour out of black vans when her father hosted anything fashionable, but he carried himself with the caution of someone who had learned how quickly a day could turn. Your father sent word. He wants Juniper in the back stall before 11. Out of sight. Why? The question leaped out before she could dress it up and make it polite. Tom's eyes flicked toward the house. Because he said so. Then, softer, to her, they're setting up cameras near the south lawn. Press likes anything with a heart in it. Horses do well on film. But your father says there's a protocol. He gave the word back exactly as he'd received it, heavy with someone else's meaning. I'll put him away after our walk, Evelyn said, and Tom nodded, relief loosening his shoulders. Mrs. Hart asked me to give you this. He held out a small tin. Shortbread. The cook saved the edges for you. His smile landed cleanly for a moment. And for him. He lifted his chin at Juniper. If you ask me, he works harder than the rest of us. After Tom left, Evelyn leaned her forehead to Juniper's and let herself be still enough to hear the inside of her heartbeat. I'll be in the house most of the day, she told him. But I'll sneak out after the speeches, I promise. We'll go down to the creek and pretend it's a river no one can own. He blew a warm breath against her cheek, and she had the ridiculous thought that if promises had weight, his breath could carry them. From the terrace, a burst of activity, cases opening, tripods clicking, a man laughing too loudly at something no one else found funny. A snatch of a sentence drifted clear on a lucky breeze, image control, absolutely no surprises. Evelyn looked instinctively at her leg, at the way the brace made her hemline bump against her calf. Image control. She imagined those words stitched into the lining of her father's jacket, a mantra he could touch whenever he needed reassurance. You're not a surprise, she told Juniper, and tried to believe she wasn't either. Back at the gate she hesitated, hand on the latch. The house was a distance measured not in yards but in expectations. She turned once more to the paddock. "Stay near?" she asked, knowing how silly it was to ask a horse to promise anything. He bobbed his head, an accident of timing, a nod that wasn't a nod at all, and she felt the thin thread of courage that ran through her pull taut. Inside, the corridors had begun to fill with voices. A woman with a clipboard directed two men carrying a floral arrangement so large it looked like something an apology would hide behind. Evelyn slipped along the wall and into the music room, where the light fell dust-soft and the piano sat with its mouth closed. She stood behind a curtain and peeked out at the south lawn. Her father was shaking hands with a mayor who wore his sash like he was born in it. Reporters waited at a polite distance, pens already poised to turn future into legend. Mrs. Hart found her there. "I was about to send a search party," she said, but she didn't sound angry. She looked past the glass, to the crowd, and then down to Evelyn's dress. "You look lovely." A small pause. "We'll keep to the library during the speeches. I've set a tray there with books and lemonade. Will anyone come in?" Evelyn asked. "Just me," Mrs. Hart said. Then, after a second, with a familiar mixture of apology and defiance, "Because that's what I decided." Evelyn nodded. "Juniper will be in the back stall," she said. "Tom's already on it." "Good," Mrs. Hart said, a word that tried to mean comfort and landed as compromise. Down the hall, a door opened and closed. The house seemed to gather itself, all the air folding toward that event horizon on the lawn. Evelyn smoothed her skirt and took a breath measured to last her through an afternoon of invisibility. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a white horse lifted his head, listening. He couldn't know the plans men made or the way a lie could be dressed as protection and set gently in a child's lap. But he knew the weather, and the way a storm feels before anyone names it. He knew the shape of Evelyn's steps and the cadence of her voice when it tried to be brave. He knew, without needing the word, what it meant to stay. The day turned its face toward spectacle. And in the cool, book-scented quiet of the library, where she would soon be tucked away like a valuable letter no one intended to send, Evelyn pressed her palm to the window and watched the world gather without her. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself it was simply this way. But in the paddock, Juniper shifted, restless, as if the earth itself had whispered something untrue. By late morning the south lawn had turned into a stage. A white canopy floated over a small forest of microphones. Banners in navy and gold whispered the message in letters big enough for the sky to read, "Blackthorn Memorial, a future without limits." Cameramen tested angles. A publicist rehearsed a smile. The mayor practiced looking grateful. Inside, the library had been arranged like a waiting room for a polite disappearance. Lemonade beaded with cold on a silver tray. A stack of books that Evelyn loved sat within easy reach, as if love could be scheduled. Mrs. Hart tucked a quilt over the window seat. "You ring if you need me," she said. "I'll be in the corridor." "I'm fine," Evelyn said, which was what the day required of her. Mrs. Hart left. The library door clicked shut. From the lawn came the rise and fall of a sound check, applause tried on for size. Evelyn traced the gold embossing on the spine of a book she'd read 3 times and didn't open it. Silence pressed against the glass. Somewhere down the hall a radio crackled, then stilled. The door opened without a knock. Miss Vale, the new governess, stepped in with her clipboard in posture that could align a room. "Evelyn," she said, brisk. "Your father has a special plan for you today." Evelyn folded her hands to stop them from fluttering. "Mrs. Hart said I would stay here." "Plans change." Miss Vale's smile was a straight line. "There's a seamstress waiting at the gardener's cottage with some fabric samples. Your father wants to surprise you with a new riding dress." She tilted her head toward the window. "We'll avoid the south lawn. Quiet paths. No fuss. A gift. From him." The words felt wrong in her mouth and then wrong for feeling wrong. Evelyn glanced toward the paddocks, a reflex. A square of white moved along the back fence, Juniper, pacing, the restless geometry of his concerns sketched in hoof and shadow. "I should tell Mrs. Hart," Evelyn said. "I have already informed her," Miss Vale lied with the confidence of a professional. "Bring your ribbon." She pointed at the pale blue thread in Evelyn's hair. "The seamstress will match the tone." Evelyn touched the ribbon, felt its smoothness like a memory she could hold. "All right," she said, because the word had been made so useful to everyone else. In the service corridor Miss Vale's heels clicked a metronome for haste. 2 men in suits moved ahead of them, the kind of quiet men who made events happen as if by weather. At a side door, a black SUV waited with the engine low and ready. The driver glanced in the mirror and didn't glance again. "We'll be quick," Ms. Vale said. In and out. The car slid along the gravel perimeter road, away from the canopy and of flags and of practiced smiles. The gardener's cottage sat where the estate fell into trees, a square of brick and slate roof tucked into an old orchard that remembered a different century. No smoke in the chimney. No curtains in the windows. No hint of a seamstress. Evelyn's mouth went dry. She swallowed. "Is she inside?" Ms. Vale opened the door with a key that looked new. The air inside was colder than the day warranted, smelling of dust and disuse. A wooden chair, a narrow bed, a pitcher and basin set as if for a photograph of a simpler time no one had asked to live in. "There's no seamstress," Evelyn said, and her voice didn't shake as much as it wanted to. Ms. Vale's smile faltered, then rearranged itself into something that might pass for sympathy if you didn't look directly at it. "Your father needs you out of the way for a few hours," she said softly. "The press is unpredictable. He doesn't want them to surprise you with questions." She gestured toward the bed. "We brought sandwiches. There's lemonade. I'll be just outside. You're locking me in." The sentence surprised them both with how quickly it found the air. Ms. Vale set the sandwiches on the table as if setting down proof of gentleness. "Only until the speeches are finished. It won't be long." The two men stood at the threshold, shadows with earpieces. One had a bundle of leather in his hands, the kind of strap used to secure trunks. He avoided looking at the brace on Evelyn's leg. "I want Mrs. Hart," Evelyn said. "Please." "I'm here," came a voice from the doorway behind the men. "Mrs. Hart." Hair slightly askew, breath not yet caught. She had run. She had found them. She stepped past the suits with the quiet authority of a woman who had once tucked a fevered child through the night. "I'll stay with her," she told Ms. Vale. "I'll sit the hours right beside her if I must." Ms. Vale's gaze flit to the men, to the car idling, to the phone in her hand. "Mr. Blackthorne was explicit," she said. An apology did not do much work under the words. "No staff inside. He thought that would be confusing." "Confusing to whom?" Mrs. Hart asked. The question hung between them like a line that one could cross and not return from. The earpiece man cleared his throat. "We're behind schedule." Evelyn reached for Mrs. Hart's fingers, and the older woman folded her hand around the child's like a promise anchoring two shores. "It will be all right," Mrs. Hart said, and this time it was a prayer. Ms. Vale's voice softened. "Evelyn, listen to me. Sometimes adults make choices that children don't understand. Your father is protecting the family. He believes this is best." "Best for whom?" Evelyn asked, and the words tasted like metal. "They took the ribbon from her hair. I'll keep it safe for the seamstress," Ms. Vale said, and the small theft felt bigger than it should have. They did not take the brace, as if mercy could be measured in what was allowed to remain. When the door closed, the click was polite. The key turned with a sound that did not bother to pretend. The men's footsteps retreated across the flagstones. The engine's hum softened, then vanished down the lane. Silence came back in and sat down with them, uninvited. Mrs. Hart pressed her palm to the window pane. "He went too far," she said, "to the glass, to the trees, to the part of the world that writes things down." Evelyn sat on the bed and looked at the picture as if it might explain itself. "He thinks people will laugh at me," she said, and the sentence did something strange as it left her. It grew smaller. "He thinks I am a problem to solve." Mrs. Hart knelt to look her in the eyes. "You are a child to love," she said fiercely, and then softened the edges. "He is afraid of the wrong things." Evelyn took a breath that went nowhere useful. "He wanted the ribbon," she whispered, surprised by how much that hurt. "Juniper won't know where I am without it." "Juniper knows your voice," Mrs. Hart said. "He knows your steps. He knows you." They waited. Time changed shape inside the cottage, stretching thin and then snapping back. A fly traced a floorboard crack and gave up. Dust made a faint galaxy in the light from the small window. From far off came the muffled envelope of applause carried strangely through trees. On the south lawn, Charles Blackthorne stepped to a microphone and let the crowd's attention settle on him like a cloak woven for his shoulders alone. He spoke the language he had taught himself: vision, stewardship, legacy. He gestured toward blueprints on an easel, toward an artist's rendering of a hospital wing that looked like a promise package for sale. Cameras caught his good side. He only had good sides. When a reporter tried to ask about recent rumors, the publicist intervened and the mayor admired the magnolia trees. A child's name did not pass anyone's lips. Behind the paddocks, Tom slid the bolt on the back stall and winced at the scrape of metal. Juniper stood inside, chest and shoulder painted with the impatience of a creature built for open rooms. Tom had laid clean straw, filled the water, cracked the top door for air. The stall was safe, safety was not the point. Juniper's ears flicked to every sound in the stable as if he were sorting them into useful and useless. Wind through slats, useless. Barn cat landing from the rafters, useless. Footsteps in the yard, watch. The gulf where one step should have been, useful, wrong. Easy, boy, Tom murmured, guilt tightening his mouth. It's just for a bit. Juniper nosed the lower door, felt the iron, measured the distance to the hinge with the body's math. He blew through his nostrils, the sound like a bellows stoking a small, necessary fire. He shifted his weight under the question of what to do. Back at the cottage, sunlight tilted toward afternoon, pulling the orchard's shadows long. Evelyn stood and tested the door again, not because she thought it had changed but because hope can be stubborn in children and horses. The latch held. She pressed her ear to the wood. The world on the other side kept going as if she had agreed to absence. If I shout, she asked, will anyone hear? The groundsmen might, Mrs. Hart said. But they've been sent to the lower fields. She brushed a strand of hair from Evelyn's forehead with a tenderness that refused approval. We will wait. And we will remember. Evelyn nodded. Waiting was a skill she'd been practicing since she could walk. She went to the small window and stood on tiptoe to see the slice of sky it offered. A hawk sketched circles. A cloud tested an edge. She imagined the path back, past the orchard wall, across the lane, along the hedgerow that hid the service road, through the rose alleys, down to the paddocks where a white horse had surely already worn a trench with his pacing. On the south lawn, the speech swelled toward its quotation. Charles spoke of the future, of children who would be given every chance to stand tall. Applause scaffolded the easy righteousness. He lifted the ceremonial scissors and, smiling, cut a silk ribbon that matched exactly the color of the one Miss Vale had taken from Evelyn's hair. In the dim of the back stall, Juniper tossed his head and struck the door with his foreleg. The wood shuddered. The hinge told him a fact about the world, strong, but not unbreakable. Tom, in the aisle, looked toward the house and then back at the horse. Complicity sat on his shoulders like a jacket that didn't fit. Don't, he whispered. Not yet. Not while they're looking. Juniper stilled at the sound of a young voice he knew, Evelyn's, carrying on the wind in the thin, high tone of a child calling a name they're not sure will return. It wasn't really her, it was memory misheard, the mind making do. He pivoted, ears forward, trying to pin the sound in place. The world outside gave him another clue, the quiet cadence of something missing. He pressed his head against the gap at the top door and tasted the air. Orchard. Dust. The thread-thin scent of the girl who moved heel-toe, and touched his nose with hands that steadied themselves on his steadiness. Dusk began to collect under the trees like a secret. In the cottage, Mrs. Hart watched Evelyn's face go pale in the pre-evening light and decided on a line she wouldn't let herself cross again. She stood. No more, she said, as if saying it could put weight in the word. She went to the door and hammered her palm against it. Open this. Now. Silence answered, respectful in its refusal. Mrs. Hart pressed her forehead to the wood and spoke in a voice that had put stubborn infants to sleep and convinced frightened boys to face stitches without flinching. Hold on, she told Evelyn. Hold on. Far across the grounds, under a canopy that made twilight look kind, Charles Blackthorne lifted his hands to bask in applause. He had arranged the day so that he would be applauded while his daughter learned what a locked door sounds like. It was not an accident. It was a choice. And in the back stall, the white horse lowered his head, set his shoulder where wood met iron, and began to ask the door a different question. Night came down over the Blackthorne estate like a slow-closing lid. The press vans had rolled away in neat, rumbling lines. The white canopy still stood on the south lawn, glowing faintly from leftover string lights, a ghost of the day's performance. Inside the mansion, the last of the guests clinked glasses in the drawing room, their laughter softening into the comfortable self-assurance of people who believed they'd seen the whole truth. But the truth was still out there, in a locked orchard cottage, and in a back stall where a white horse no longer stood still. Juniper's ears twitched toward the lane for the 100th time. Every sound from outside, the scrape of a branch, the call of a nightjar, was filtered through a single question: where is she? The air in the stall carried Evelyn's scent only faintly now, fading under the heavier smells of hay and leather. He shifted his weight, muscles rippling under his coat, and tested the stall door again. The lower half held firm, but the top, hinged and latched, had a weakness. His mother's training, from before he came to the Blackthorne estate, had taught him to push latches with his lips to open feed bins. Evelyn had laughed the first time he'd shown her, calling him too clever for your own good. He nipped at the latch now, twisting it in small, patient motions. Metal squeaked. The sound carried into the aisle. Tom, the young stable hand, sat on an overturned bucket, head bowed, chewing at his thumbnail. He'd been told to keep Juniper secured until morning, but he couldn't meet the horse's eyes for long. When Juniper finally lifted the latch, the creak made Tom look up. Juniper. The stallion shoved the top door open, nostrils flaring. Tom rose, palms out. You can't. If he sees you lose tonight, it's my job. Juniper stepped forward anyway, the restlessness in his body turning to decision. He nudged Tom hard enough to shift the boy sideways. Tom froze, caught between the rules that kept him employed and the knowledge that some rules were made to be broken. He thought about the little girl's pale face that morning, the way she'd clung to the ribbon in her hair. He thought about the locked cottage. Tom stepped back. Go, then, he whispered. Go find her. Juniper trotted out into the night. The gravel under his hoofs made a sound like breaking silence. The air was cool, threaded with the smell of apple blossom from the old orchard. He followed it. The grounds stretched wide and manicured near the house, but past the rose alleys the land grew rougher, old stone walls, patches of wild grass, and the crooked line of the orchard trees. Juniper knew these paths. Evelyn had led him here on spring mornings when no one was watching, the brace on her leg clicking in rhythm with his steps. He lowered his head, nostrils working. Her scent was here, recent but faint, tangled with the sharper smell of the two suited men who had walked beside her earlier. He followed the mix of smells down the lane, ears flicking forward and back to catch any movement. In the orchard cottage, Evelyn sat on the bed, her legs tucked up under her dress, watching the door like something might change if she stared long enough. Mrs. Hart paced in the small space, her hands worrying the hem of her apron. You're shivering, Mrs. Hart said, coming to sit beside her. She pulled the quilt from the bed and wrapped it around Evelyn's shoulders. He'll come back soon. He won't, Evelyn said quietly. Not until everyone's gone. They both turned at the faint sound outside, a soft, deliberate thud. Not footsteps. Heavier. Rhythmic. Evelyn's heart gave a sudden leap. Juniper, she whispered. Mrs. Hart crossed to the window, pressing her cheek to the cold glass. The moon had lifted just enough to silver the orchard, and there, between the shadowed trees, moved a shape white as a dropped handkerchief. The horse paused, head high, scanning. Then he walked toward the cottage. Juniper reached the door and sniffed at the wood, his breath quick and loud in the stillness. He could smell Evelyn clearly now, her skin, the leather of her brace, the faint sweetness of the shortbread she'd carried earlier. He pawed at the threshold, the strike of hoof on stone echoing through the quiet. Inside, Evelyn was already on her feet, the quilt trailing behind her. He found me, she said, almost laughing. Mrs. Hart pressed her palm to her mouth. God help us, he really did. The door was bolted, the windows small. Juniper circled the cottage once, testing the air for another way in. On the far side, his hoof struck the rusted hinge of a half-forgotten storm shutter. It shifted under the impact. He pressed his shoulder to it, metal groaning. Evelyn hurried to the window. Here. This one, she called softly, not wanting to wake whoever might be nearby. The shutter gave another inch. Then another. Rust flaked away in the moonlight. Juniper worked at it, patient and relentless, until it banged open just enough to let a child slip through, if that child had help from someone on the inside. Mrs. Hart looked at Evelyn. If we go now, there's no going back before he knows. Evelyn met her gaze. Then we don't go back. They worked quickly. Mrs. Hart boosted Evelyn up to the window. Juniper stepped close enough for her to catch his mane, her fingers twining into the coarse hair like it was rope. She slid down his side, landing with a soft thump on the grass. Go, Mrs. Hart urged, handing the quilt after her. Find the lower lane. Avoid the lights. I'll cover your trail. Juniper lowered his head, nuzzling Evelyn's shoulder as if to check she was real. She pressed her face to his neck, breathing in the warm, familiar scent. Take me home, she whispered. And in the next moment, they were moving, through the orchard, across the darkened fields, the sound of hooves steady as a heartbeat. Evelyn clung tight, the night air cutting at her cheeks, the brace on her leg knocking softly against the saddle's worn leather. Somewhere behind them, a door slammed. Voices shouted into the dark. But ahead, the lane stretched toward the paddocks, and beyond that, toward the town where lights still burned in windows that belonged to people who didn't hide their children away. Juniper kept running. And Evelyn, for the first time all day, felt the cage around her begin to break. The moon was high by the time Juniper's hooves struck the cobbled edge of Blackthorn's main drive. Evelyn clung to his mane, her knees aching from the brace's unyielding leather, but her mind was fixed on one thought: get to people who will see me. Not servants told to look away, not guards trained to follow orders, people who would ask questions her father couldn't smother. Juniper slowed as they approached the south lawn. The canopy was still up, but the crowd was thinner now, mostly lingering guests, journalists finishing their notes, and a few townsfolk who had wandered close after hearing about free champagne and music. Lanterns cast warm circles of light that pulled on the grass. Charles Blackthorne stood in the middle of it all, speaking to a cluster of investors. His smile was intact, his suit still perfect, but his voice carried the faint rasp of a man who had been performing all day. Evelyn's heart thudded. She had never interrupted her father in public. She had been taught, drilled, that the family image depended on her silence. But tonight, she had Juniper under her, his breath warm and alive between her knees, and Mrs. Hart's words still in her ears: "You are a child to love." Juniper didn't hesitate. He walked straight across the lawn, cutting between guests in silk dresses and tailored coats. Heads turned. A murmur rose, first of recognition for the horse, then of confusion at the small figure on his back. "Is that," someone whispered. "Thought he didn't have kids. Looks just like Amelia." Charles saw them then. His expression froze, the smile faltering for the briefest flicker before he rebuilt it. "Evelyn," he said, voice warm enough to fool a stranger. What a surprise. Evelyn slid down from Juniper's back. The grass was soft under her feet, the brace clicking in a sudden hush. Every sound, the rustle of silk, the clink of a glass being set down, seemed magnified. "I was in the orchard cottage," she said. Her voice was clear, louder than she meant. "You locked me there." A ripple went through the guests. Cameras lifted, instinctive. One flash went off. Charles laughed, the sound brittle. "My dear, that's nonsense. You must be tired. Let's get you inside." Juniper stepped between them, planting himself so that Charles had to stop. The stallion's head lowered slightly, ears pinned just enough to send a message any horseman would understand: not this time. Evelyn touched Juniper's neck. "You didn't want them to see me." "Because of my leg." Charles's jaw tightened. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," she said. From the edge of the crowd, a man in a worn leather jacket stepped forward, someone Evelyn didn't recognize. He carried a camera, not the sleek kind the press used, but heavy, scuffed, the sort that suggested long hours and dangerous stories. "Name's Walker," he called. "Independent journalist. Been digging into Blackthorne's charity books for 6 months. Funny thing, couldn't find a single record mentioning a daughter." All eyes swung back to Charles. His voice was still calm, but the edges had sharpened. "I protect my family's privacy. That is my right." Walker lifted his camera. "It's not privacy if you lock the door." A murmur rose again, louder this time, sharper. Several townsfolk edged closer. Someone from the mayor's staff leaned in to whisper urgently. A woman with a press badge began filming on her phone. Charles turned on Evelyn, his eyes narrowing just enough for her to see the truth under the mask. "Come with me. Now." Juniper shifted forward, cutting off his path again. The crowd gasped, half at the audacity, half at the symbolism no one could miss. "Leave her be," someone called from the back. Another voice joined in, "She's a child." Evelyn felt the weight of the moment. She could step back and the night would close over her, or she could speak, and change everything. "My mother gave me Juniper before she died," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd, finding the faces that were listening. "She said he would never let me be alone. She was right." Walker lowered his camera, his voice carrying. "Mr. Blackthorne, you've built a fortune selling an image of compassion. Tonight, the whole town sees the truth." Charles opened his mouth to answer, but the sudden sound of hooves on stone drew every head. Tom, the stable hand, rode in on a bay mare, Mrs. Hart behind him. She slid to the ground and came straight to Evelyn, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "She's telling the truth," Mrs. Hart said, her voice steady enough to slice through the murmurs. "I was there. He locked her in that cottage so no one would see her limp." The crowd erupted, outrage, disbelief, questions thrown like stones. And then came the final blow. Walker's assistant, a young woman with a tablet, stepped forward and held up a still frame from security footage, Evelyn being led into the cottage by 2 suited men, the door locking behind her. Gasps spread through the gathering like wind through dry grass. Charles's face drained of color. The mayor quietly stepped away. Investors exchanged looks and began pocketing business cards. For the first time in Evelyn's life, her father looked smaller than the space he stood in. She stood there, brace glinting in the lantern light, Juniper beside her, Mrs. Hart's hand steady on her shoulder. And in that moment, under the weight of dozens of watching eyes, Evelyn realized she was no longer invisible. The lie was gone, shattered in front of the people who would carry the story far beyond the Blackthorn gates. And somewhere in the restless stamping of Juniper's hooves, she could almost hear her mother's voice, "The world doesn't need perfection, it needs compassion." The crowd didn't disperse that night. Not immediately. The air was thick with whispers, the kind that carried truth faster than any speech. Under the lanterns, Charles Blackthorn tried to hold himself together, shoulders squared, jaw set, but every time he reached for words, another voice rose against him. "You locked her up. Is this the man funding the children's hospital? Shame." A few guests slipped quietly to their cars, unwilling to be part of the scene any longer. Others stayed, hungry to witness the fall. Reporters scribbled, cameras rolled. Walker and his assistant kept their ground, eyes fixed on Charles, ready to catch any word that might seal his fate. Evelyn stood beside Juniper, the stallion calm now, as if knowing his job had been done. Mrs. Hart's arm stayed firm across the girl's shoulders, a silent wall of protection. Charles finally turned toward them, not as a father, but as a man cornered. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, voice low enough for only them to hear. Evelyn looked straight at him. "I understand perfectly. You didn't want the world to see me. But now they do." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. A reporter nearby caught every word. By the next morning, the story had already traveled far. Local billionaire accused of hiding disabled daughter. Blackthorn scandal, locked cottage, hero horse, and a child's voice. The footage from Walker's assistant spread online, Evelyn's small figure being led into the cottage, Juniper's dramatic arrival in the crowd. It was more than a scandal, it was a symbol. People began sending letters to the Blackthorn estate, not to Charles, but to Evelyn, letters of support, drawings of white horses, messages from strangers telling her she was beautiful, strong, and worth seeing. Investors pulled out of Charles's projects. The hospital board called an emergency meeting. The mayor issued a statement deeply troubled by the revelations. And then, quietly, authorities opened an investigation, not only into the treatment of Evelyn, but into certain irregularities in Charles's charity accounts that Walker had been tracking for months. 3 weeks later, the Blackthorn gates opened for a different reason. Mrs. Hart stood with Evelyn at the top of the steps as Charles, flanked by 2 plainclothes officers, was led to a waiting car. He didn't look back. The estate would be tied up in court for months, maybe years. But one thing was decided quickly: Evelyn would go to live with her mother's sister in town. Her aunt, Margaret, arrived in a plain green coat and hugged Evelyn like she'd been missing her for a lifetime. "I should have come sooner," Margaret whispered. "You're here now," Evelyn said. They didn't leave without Juniper. The townsfolk had already raised a petition to keep him with Evelyn, arguing he'd been her lifeline, her protector. Even the court-appointed guardian agreed, separating them would be cruel. And so, on a bright spring afternoon, Evelyn rode Juniper down the long drive, Mrs. Hart and Aunt Margaret walking alongside. At the edge of town, people lined the streets, shopkeepers, schoolchildren, neighbors, applauding as they passed. Someone had hung a banner across Main Street, "Welcome home, Evelyn." Months later, the meadow just beyond the town's edge bloomed with wildflowers. Evelyn rode there often, Juniper's pace steady, his ears flicking at the sound of her laugh. She no longer hid her brace, sometimes she didn't even wear a skirt long enough to cover it. People waved as she passed, and she waved back. One summer morning, a group of local children asked if they could paint Juniper for the town fair. Evelyn agreed, and the next weekend a life-sized wooden carving of a white stallion stood in the town square, mane flowing, eyes alert. Beneath it, a bronze plaque read, "Juniper, a friend who saw the truth." On the day the statue was unveiled, Evelyn stood beside it, her hand resting on Juniper's warm neck. She spoke to the gathered crowd, her voice clear, steady. "People sometimes think hiding something will protect it. But hiding doesn't make it safe, it makes it lonely. My father hid me because he thought my leg made me less. But I am not less. I am me. And I had someone who wouldn't let me disappear." She glanced at Juniper, who flicked his tail as if in agreement. "If you ever feel like you don't belong, find the people, and the animals, who see you for exactly who you are. And never let them go." That evening, back in the meadow, Evelyn leaned forward in the saddle, resting her cheek against Juniper's neck. The horizon blushed pink with the setting sun. "The world doesn't need perfection," she whispered, remembering her mother's words. "It needs compassion." Juniper snorted softly, as if promising to remember it, too. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt truly, completely seen.